To say that gender is performative is to say that it's a certain kind of enactment. The appearance of gender is often mistaken as a sign of its internal or enduring truth. Gender is prompted by obligatory norms that repeat over time and that take different forms according to spatial locations. And these norms demand that we become one gender or the other, usually within a strictly binary frame. So the reproduction of gender is always a negotiation with power. And finally, there's no gender without this reproduction of norms that risks undoing or redoing the norm in unexpected ways, opening up the possibility of a remaking of gendered reality along new lines. These new lines are neither good nor bad, but I would suggest merely possible. And this opening of possibilities challenges the presupposition that the reproduction of gender is fixed either by biology, nature, economics, or other apparent truths of anthropology or linguistics. The normative implication of this analysis is to be found in the call to let the lives of gender and sexual minorities become more possible, that is to say, more livable, but it does not consist in prescribing which gender performances are right and which are wrong. It does not consist in prescribing which gender performances are truly subversive and which are co-opted. I don't think any of those decisions can be made by some judge, but also they are always situational problems and have to be analyzed in terms of very concrete situations. Precarity, on the other hand, describes a few different conditions that pertain to living beings. And I want to suggest it implicates us in a non-human world of life. Anything living can be expunged by accident or through a set of willful acts. And this expungibility or destructibility is a feature of living. There's no living being without it, no living being whose persistence is guaranteed through space and time. And yet, although I assert this generality, I don't want to accept this simply as an existential truth and stop there. Indeed, it's a condition that makes a political demand. It's a politically demanding condition that compels us to think about the social and institutional conditions of our lives, who is sheltered, who is not, who is grievable, who is not, who receives food and who does not, how the unequal distribution of basic goods takes place, and how the unequal distribution of the grievability of lives takes place. Political orders, including economic and social institutions, ought to be, and this is a prescriptive point, ought to address those very needs, not only to guarantee the availability of housing and food, but to make sure that the means by which life is perpetuated are available to populations on egalitarian grounds. So precarity, in my view, designates that politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support more than others and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. So it's also, I want to suggest, a condition of politically induced vulnerability, which is not to say that all vulnerability is politically induced, but it is to say that whatever vulnerability we have as bodily creatures in the world is differentially exploited by certain organizations of power. Now, I want to suggest to you that precarity directly links with gender norms, and I just want to make this link and then open up our discussion some. We know that those who do not live their genders in intelligible or acceptable ways are at heightened risk for harassment and violence. And I've learned a bit in recent years about gender violence projects and attacks, especially on black women and black lesbians in Johannesburg, for instance. Gender norms have everything to do with how and in what way we can appear in public space, how and in what way the public and private are distinguished, and how that distinction is instrumentalized in the service of sexual politics, who will be criminalized on the basis of public appearance, that is to say, who will be treated as a criminal or produced as a criminal or treated as a target and in fact targeted, who will fail to be protected by the law, who will be threatened by the law, the police, the legal system, who will be able to walk the street, who will not be able to walk the street, who will be able to stay on the job and who will lose it, and who will be able to feel safe in the home and who will find sexual violence precisely there in the home. So when we ask these questions, who will be stigmatized and disenfranchised, at the same time that they sometimes become objects of fascination or consumer pleasure, we are really asking who is exposed to precarious conditions and on what differential basis we are exposed to precarious conditions. What I want to be able to just add to this is that the subject who, the I, let's say this, the I who comes to struggle against precarious conditions or lack of protection or lack of entitlement or lack of mobility or lack of food or lack of work, is one who emerges from a condition of precarity and who articulates his, her politics against that condition. You'll remember, of course, that for Foucault, the I is produced through power, although it's never a deterministic, effective power. Even though it cannot tell us all we need to know about the I, or indeed the workings of power, Foucault's formulation remains important. And what I want to suggest remains important to me has to do with how power takes on a performative dimension. For power relies on a mechanism of reproduction that can and does go array. There is no institution of homophobia, for instance, that does not have to re-elaborate and re-institutionalize itself. Okay? It doesn't just exist as a kind of entity. It must re-elaborate itself in space and time, which means that there are mechanisms for that re-elaboration, which also means that as a re-elaborating mechanism, it can and does go awry. It can be intervened upon through tactical moves in order to interrupt what seems to be the flow of its reproducibility. The paradox that emerges from this situation is one that we find in politics all the time. If the terms of power lay out who can be a subject, who qualifies as an intelligible subject, who's capable of being recognized in politics before the law, then the subject is not a precondition of politics, but a differential effect of power. And it seems to me that there are sexual and gender norms that condition who or who will not be legible, who or who will not be recognizable, who is overexposed, who's underexposed, and what kinds of dangers go with overexposure and underexposure. But it seems to me that we have to enter into this kind of critical practice to understand those forms of living gender that are misrecognized or remain unrecognizable precisely because they exist at the limits of established norms or because they challenge those norms, the norms that govern embodiment and also personhood. The performativity of gender is thus bound up with the differential ways in which subjects become eligible for recognition, and recognition depends fundamentally on what kinds of languages, structures, institutions are available, whether the language, whether it is possible to be articulated within discourse and institutions in such a way that the precarity of the body can be addressed and become something sustainable rather than a target of injury or destruction. Okay, so in my early work, I guess in Gender Trouble, which is now more than 20 years old, I suggested that there was a kind of fundamental confusion about how to understand the reality of gender, that some people seem to do their gender in such a way that they were understood to achieve a kind of reality effect. Like, that's really a woman, that's really a man. That one I'm not so sure about. That one's got kind of has a phantom masculinity, or that one's got a failing femininity, or some such matter. And I think it was it had a comic and ironic dimension, and I still, as I present it, give you some of its comic and ironic dimension. But I think we have to remember that what it means not to be real or not to be intelligible also is a matter of being effaced, of not counting as an existing being. And at least at the time that I wrote that material some years ago, I was worried that those who lost their lovers from AIDS, or who lost their lovers from street violence, were not able to achieve public recognition for their loss because the love was not considered real, the life was not considered real, the disease was not considered real, and that those who achieved a certain kind of reality effect were grievable. They were capable of soliciting identification and open and public mourning. And so it matters when we talk about gender performativity, because we are talking about the differential ways in which the reality effect of personhood is achieved. One way, not the only way. The differential effect, reality effect is achieved, and that this has enormous consequences for what constitutes a grievable life, what constitutes a livable life, a life worth safeguarding, a life worth mourning. It was true that after September 11th, I sought to understand some other dimensions of precarity, and I was particularly alarmed by the U.S., in the U.S., by its self-production as an impermeable nation. How could an impermeable nation be permeated? And it seemed to me that there was a national discourse that sought not only to disavow its own vulnerability, but also to produce a kind of hyper grief over the losses of 9/11. So that many of those people, not all of them, for instance, we didn't get highly elaborated obituaries for the people who were working in those buildings illegally, the foreign nationals who were working in those buildings, some of the gay people whose family structures weren't acknowledged in the newspaper, or for many of the people who didn't have legible family structures, right? Because the way the obituaries worked is like, not only was this great American citizen lost, but they lost a family and a dog and property, and if you didn't have family and dog and property, you couldn't really write the obituary. Okay. So, but at the same time that we had this kind of hyper-grievability, it seemed to me that we were engaging in wars in which we were destroying populations who remained nameless and who were understood as nothing other than enemies who sought to destroy us, and whom and it was then our obligation to destroy them first, and hence not to understand them in any way as grievable lives, as lives that are worth grieving, which means as lives that are worthy, right? Because and they were, we might say, because so many of these populations are now a kind of phobic expansion to the Arab world as potentially an enemy, relied on crude cultural stereotypes and vulgar characterizations, very often the populations that we targeted in war were considered socially dead prior to being killed, so that by the time we killed them, we were doing nothing other than ratifying their ontological status as the socially dead. Right? Like how do you kill what is dead? But of course, ideologically, we were killing those who are already socially dead. At the same time, they're the animated dead because they come at us and seek to destroy our lives. So this is a certain kind of ideological phantasmatic formation that certainly characterized the Bush years, but unfortunately still, to a large extent, pervade the Obama years, much to our disappointment. Okay, so that takes you from gender performativity to war. That's about as much as I can do right now. We're going to do some anti-Zionism later today, and tomorrow, Monday, or we can discuss what my relationship is to Zionism or to the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and my recent work, which has been on Jewish philosophy and questions of cohabitation and binationalism. It follows from some of my earlier thinking on alliance, what it is to live together or work together, become mobilized together on the basis of relations that are intransigent or difficult or antagonistic, and what it means to move forward on that model. So my thinking about binationalism is not about happy harmonies or the resolution of all difference, but rather the ethically obligatory character of living and working with others we have not always chosen or with whom we sometimes very deeply disagree. So I'm interested in the formation of those kinds of collectivities and what kinds of political mobilizations can happen on the basis of them. All right, please.